War. Expulsion. Exiles. This is the story of the Germans who found themselves caught up in World War II. Enjoy the war, because peace will be hell. This sardonic comment was common among the German ranks towards the end of World War II. Both combatants and civilians knew that once the Nazi regime fell, there would be no mercy for the survivors. But reality exceeded even their most pessimistic expectations. Just months after the surrender, millions of people of German origin suffered terrible persecution that reached every corner of Eastern Europe. For many, this suffering was completely justified, but for those affected, it was constant torture. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will delve into the agony and injustices that these men and women experienced simply because they were German. Stay with us to learn all about the brutal flight and expulsion of the German people at the end of World War II. By the end of 1945, Germany was in chaos. Nothing remained of the mighty German army of the previous years. Now, the few units that were still capable of fighting were made up of young, old, or inexperienced troops who had to face an imposing force. The fearsome Red Army, thirsty for blood and eager for revenge, had finally reached the heart of the Third Reich. German civilians had heard rumors about the behavior of Stalin's soldiers towards anyone who had been born on German soil. It was said that anyone who fell into their hands was killed on the spot or taken to forced labor camps where they had little access to food and drink. Women were sexually abused without any remorse and then executed. Seeking to escape this terrible fate, German citizens began a mass exodus, abandoning their homes and taking with them only what they could carry. However, for some it was too late. The Soviets advanced with astonishing speed, crushing the inexperienced Nazi soldiers who stood in their way. And when they came upon a German village, they proved that the rumors had not been exaggerated.
Weil ich immer gehört hatte, der Russe macht Genickschüsse, da habe ich mich hingelegt, dass ich den Kopf auf die Erde hatte. Denke ich, dann kann er ja schießen. Und da hat er meine Tochter erschossen. Und dann rief mein Neffe, mich nicht totschießen, mich nicht totschießen. Ich sag, Klaus, was willst du denn noch leben, wenn wir alle tot sind? Und dann war es auch schon still, waren die auch alle erschossen.
According to some rumors, Stalin's commissars had given their subordinates explicit permission to behave as they pleased, to avenge the cruelties committed by the Nazis. But these men made no distinction between enemy soldiers, women, the elderly, or defenseless children. Those Germans reluctant to leave their homes did not hesitate when they witnessed the brutality of the Soviets. It is estimated that more than 1 million people emigrated into the interior of Germany, seeking to escape the Red Army. By then, in early 1945, Europe was experiencing one of its harshest winters. The refugees had to face terrible snowfalls and blizzards, often with little warm clothing. A large number of those who fled, usually the elderly and those with some illness, did not survive the journey. Deaths from hypothermia became a common occurrence at the sides of the long lines of the exodus. But civilians were not safe on the roads either. According to some estimates, an average refugee was able to advance a maximum of 10 kilometers a day in these conditions. The Soviets made 3 times that distance in the same time. And when one of these units came across the line of refugees, there was often no room for mercy. People were robbed, tortured, abused, and killed. The few German soldiers who did encounter them could do little to protect them.
Wir haben da in der Angst gelebt, ja. Ja. Sie wussten ja nicht, wenn einer kam und sagt, komm mit, dann mussten sie mitgehen. Nicht? Wenn sie sich da gewehrt haben, es war ja keiner da, wo sie Schutz gehabt hätten.
However, even those who survived both the Soviets and the journey were faced with a major problem: where to go. The war had come to Germany and was to stay. In addition to the Red Army in the east, the Western Allies were advancing rapidly in the west and were also on the German border. There seemed to be no escape. Many imagined that the safest place in the Reich would be in Berlin, and although they could count on a few months of peace, the war eventually reached them there as well. On April 20th, 1945, the same day Adolf Hitler turned 56, Russian guns began to attack the capital of the Reich. The Nazis offered a desperate defense, but only held out for a few days before the Soviets were able to penetrate into the city. It was obvious even to the most fanatical that Germany had been defeated. Unable to accept this reality, many Nazi leaders took their own lives, including the Führer. Several others escaped under false identities through passages known only to a few, but the vast majority of civilians, including many refugees who had arrived from various parts of the country, did not manage to escape. They were left at the complete mercy of the savage, bloodthirsty Soviet troops. The same thing that had happened in the rest of the country also occurred in Berlin. Any male over the age of 16 was killed or imprisoned, suspected of being a soldier or officer disguised as a civilian. Even some minors suffered the same fate, as members of the Hitler Youth had been some of the staunchest defenders during this battle. Women, on the other hand, were subjected to brutal sexual abuse. Thousands of them decided to commit suicide rather than bear the shame of having been raped for the rest of their days.
And then they came downstairs to the basement, putting this cardboard on the table, telling the people in Berlin, Väterchen Stalin gave his troops the right to rape, to steal, to kill, to do whatever they want to do. And believe me, they did.
The savagery continued for over a week, until on May 8, 1945, the surviving German leaders signed their unconditional surrender. World War II in Europe had come to an end. The surviving German citizens found their nation in ruins, and the hatred of the rest of the world blaming them for starting a conflict that claimed the lives of 70 million people. Yet, despite shattered cities, destroyed homes, and dead family members, many thought that surrender meant an end to their hardships. Unfortunately, they were very wrong. On July 17, 1945, the leaders of the main winners of the war met at what became known as the Potsdam Conference. These were Soviet General Secretary Joseph Stalin, American President Harry Truman, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Together, the three men decided how Germany should be run now that there was peace. Among the many decisions agreed upon was the return of the territories conquered by Hitler. However, the annexation of parts of Germany was also accepted, mainly by the Soviet Union and Poland. But one of the most controversial measures of the Potsdam Conference was the one that established the expulsion of all people of German origin from certain regions. In countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, those belonging to this people had to leave their homes and go to Germany. The intention of the Allied leaders was to counteract the huge transfer of German citizens that had occurred during the war, driven by Hitler and the rest of the Nazi hierarchy. But even many of those who lived there before the beginning of the conflict had to pack their bags and make this new and terrible exodus.
Jede Vertreibung, wenn sie auch auf diese oder andere Weise in Anführungsstrichen verursacht ist, die Vertriebenen haben es nicht verursacht. Und insofern ist jede Vertreibung ein Unrecht. Ja, ich würde sagen, es ist ein Verbrechen am Menschen.
The goal was to create homogeneous populations, in the belief that this would make Europe less likely to sink into war again. Whatever the reasons, tens of millions of ethnic Germans were expelled across the continent. In some cases, such as in Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, instead of turning Germans into refugees, they were imprisoned in forced labor camps. There, they had to spend years repairing the damage caused by the war, including rebuilding towns and cities destroyed by the Nazis. Stalin had even begun this transfer long before the Potsdam Conference, taking millions of Germans to camps in Central Asia. The conditions in these camps were terrible. Prisoners faced shortages of food and water, poor hygiene, and constant abuse by their jailers. Thousands died in these camps, never to see their homes again. In the rest of the countries, the situation was not much better. In Czechoslovakia, there were 4.5 million Germans when the war ended. More than 3 million were expelled to the US or Soviet-controlled parts of Germany, with only about 250,000 allowed to stay. Most of these were German women with Czech husbands. About the same number are believed to have died during the expulsion. Many of them were victims of violence, either by other desperate refugees or by criminals who harassed the roads they traveled. Faced with this situation, thousands of citizens preferred suicide to exile.
Also Schlesien bedeutet für mich Heimat, weil nur die Heimat, nur auf dem Gedanken von der Heimat kann man ein Leben fortsetzen, wenn man weiß, wo die Vorfahren gelebt haben, wo sie gearbeitet haben.
The Hungarian government, which had come under Soviet control after the war, was very harsh on Germans. Anyone identified as German in the last census in 1941 was expelled from the country. The only exceptions were men and women married to a Hungarian citizen, and certain people in key jobs, such as miners. Those who had collaborated with the Nazi regime were also ordered to leave the country or taken to labor camps. Of the nearly 500,000 Germans living in Hungary at the end of the war, only a little over 20,000 were counted in 1949. Romania was another ally of the Nazi regime, so it had a large number of Germans living on its territory. Hundreds of thousands of them had fled in the face of the Soviet advance, knowing that they were very likely to be killed or imprisoned, but a huge number stayed in the country. Approximately 200,000 were expelled after the Potsdam Conference, but unlike in other nations, many ethnic Germans were allowed to remain, although their status was severely diminished. Branded as Reich collaborators, they were stripped of their citizenship and much of their property. Those living in well-off areas were expelled to poorer parts of the country, and others were interned in the dreaded forced labor camps. Poland was one of the countries hardest hit by the mass exodus. As the first of the Nazi conquests, and sharing a border with Germany, millions of Germans were on its soil by 1945. Huge numbers fled before the end of the war, fearing Soviet retribution, but an estimated 4.5 million decided to stay. A few years later, fewer than 1 million remained on Polish soil. Citizens living in German regions that were annexed by Poland after the dissolution of the Reich were also expelled. The total number of people expelled is more than 3 million.
These
three pictures show my brother and me in the entrance to the house we would have inherited according to German law. We were expropriated by a Polish law in 1946, with no compensation.
The flight of Germans occurred in many other countries, and for many years. The Allies never kept reliable records, so an exact number of refugees is not known. However, the number is believed to have reached 12 million. A huge number died on the way, due to exposure to the weather, lack of food, and acts of violence, among other causes. Those who successfully reached Germany had to deal with a country in complete ruins and without the capacity to feed its population. In addition, there was also a housing crisis. Millions of houses had been destroyed, and there was no space to accommodate the exorbitant number of refugees. This caused deaths among the expelled to continue for years. By 1950, it is estimated that between 1 and 2.5 million people died as a result of the forced exodus. During the 1950s, when fear of a new war had diminished, many of the countries relaxed their expulsion laws and even allowed refugees to return home. However, not all of them did, and for many of them it was already too late. The governments of the nations that encouraged the exodus still to this day fail to recognize the agonies of these people, or even think that they were justified because they were part of Nazi Germany. But there is no doubt that a huge number of those affected and killed were completely innocent people who only shared their home country with the greatest villains of World War II. To ensure that the rights of those affected were recognized, several organizations were created, such as the Federation of Expellees. Founded in 1957, its members continue to fight so that this history is not forgotten, and so that those who were harmed by these arbitrary measures are finally compensated.
We have to remind people. The older people who experienced it are dying out. We are the ones who have an interest. But I don't know what's going to happen when we are no longer there.
We have reached the end of this video, and we want to ask you, do you think the expulsion of these German citizens can be justified? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.